you wrote an article on Eon called "What Does Depersonalization? What can depersonalization tell us about the sense of self?" Which is super interesting, and I've always had this like interest and curiosity about what is the self. Is this like a subjective phenomena that occurs because of some kind of, is it like an emergent phenomena of the brain, or is there something like hardcore, or like is there like an essence of self, or like what do you think it is, and what can depersonalization like tell us about the sense of self?
Yeah, so again, this is a huge debate in the literature with all
Yeah.
disciplines, traditions, but I do have a stance on it. So I'm going to tell you my point of view. So I'm not saying that this is the answer. I'm saying this is what I think is happening there. So take it with caution. So, so depending on what commitments you have as a theory level, right? You can say that a self is a thing or not a thing, right? So I'd say most of the time, if you take a like ontology, the self is not a thing like, I don't know, this cup, right? It's not the same. So it's not a material thing, like in the sense like the cup is, right? But in the same time, you can't say that the self is somehow floating in the air, right? Like in a dualistic manner, like mind-body dualist, like so you can't say that there is a substance which is not material, which is the self, which somehow comes to us and inhabits our body, right? I believe that we need to go back to something very basic, which is our body in the world, and how we are biological organism, and we are biological self-organizing organism, right? So this means that we develop from a cell to an organism, and everything, all this kind of like processing, it's centered around this kind of like self-preservation. I want to survive myself, right? This myself wants to survive, my organism, and that kind of self-centered bodily processing is necessarily around the self, right? So the body and the brain keeps track of itself, so to speak, right? Because you want to live, you want to keep going living, and actually, this is something that you can't really control. So you can see it very clearly in a sad case. So, for instance, if you wanna commit suicide, if you wanna kill yourself, you can't commit suicide by ordering your cells to actually stop for function, right? To say, okay, now you stop. I don't care about, yeah.
Right. Right.
So I can, take something like a poison, but my body, my cells would fight for themselves, hence for me, for the self, right? You know what I mean? So they will fight for me without me being aware that actually they will fight for me, right?
Right. Right.
So there is a sense in which that kind of like core self, minimal self, is fundamentally embodied and stays there until the day we die, right? It's like when we breathe, when we walk, when we think, so everything is somehow related, for better and for worse, right? As I said.
Right.
Now, that core sense of self, right, which is deeply embodied and is connected, as I said, with all our cells, with all our organs, and also with how we interact with the world and with others. Then at the high level of the, let's say, processing, that comes with a feeling, right? A certain feeling, a feeling of like a sense of self, not the self processing in itself.
Right.
It's not the same as, it shouldn't be conflated with like the self from the self-organizing body organism, right? The sense of self is something that you have at the level of conscious experience. It's something that you can see, you can feel, and that's as deeply subjective, as I said. It's like I feel it in a certain way, right? So for instance, another example to make this point clearer. So So for if I'm an anorexic person, I can see myself very fat. So whenever I look in a mirror, so I can see myself very fat, even though my bodily core self, primary self, is basically very, very thin, and actually dangerously so, right?
Right.
But what I feel is my reality. So the subjective sense of self gives you my reality, and I live as if I was extremely fat and I want to get thinner, right? So, or I want to cease to exist for many reasons, right? So that sense of subjective sense of like experience gives us the sense of reality that is there. And that's is one of the dangers that we have in with many of the like the self disorders. It's because it's so difficult to get out from that kind of like subjective reality to contrast it against something which is there, right? Physically, objectively there.
So in a way, if I can put this into this like model that I'm thinking about, let's say there are two kinds of self. Like, let's say there is this embodied self, which is your whole body, and the self that is like your body, your cells, your organs, that is the embodied self. And then there is this something else called the mental self, for the lack of a better word. And then for most people, like, these two are kind of like not one and the same. There's not clear like demarcation between these two self. And then do you think for people suffering from depersonalization or dissociation in general, is there like a split between these two selves, of like this mental self is like split off from the body self? And is dissociation just a split between the body and the mind? Because that's how like I've been seeing depersonalization in myself. It almost feels like there's my body self. There's, it doesn't need my conscious awareness. It knows how to operate. It knows how to breathe, sleep, eat, and like, replenish my body. And then I have this like mental self, which is just like where all of my thoughts are, my story. Some people would call it my ego, right? And is dissociation something like a split off between those two? Like a cut off between those two?
Well, it certainly felt that way. So that somehow echoes other self-reports that I gathered. For instance, in London, people would say like, I feel trapped inside my head and outside my body. Or I can see myself from the back of my own head and I'm on automatic pilot, right? Because as you said, it's like this day-to-day functioning of the self, of the body is going there. So your lungs are breathing without you getting involved, right? So they breathe for you. So the body itself is functioning. Luckily, you want them to function, right? You want your lungs to function. You want your heart to function for you, right? What I think is going on is there is indeed a split. It's like an imbalance, right? But I think that split comes precisely from the fact that people, it's fueled by the fact that people try to figure out what is going on, right? So the more time you spend like focusing on this kind of like disruptions that you experience, the more you basically almost withdraw yourself into the safe realm, as you said, of the mental self, because I can intellectualize what I think, what I feel, and try to figure out, right? So I'm kind of withdrawing myself into the mental self, for, as you said, for lack of better word. And I'm disconnecting myself from the body itself. And it's quite interesting because people would say something like, it's when I'm doing very dumb stuff like gardening or, doing something with my hands, blah, 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 so I forget about myself, I forget to think about myself, right? And then I realize, oh, actually, I have my sense of self back, right? but as soon as I realize it, it fades away, right? As if the fact that you attend to, remember when I said when the transparent window, when you attend to the self, right, you can see it's there, then immediately it becomes visible. So it hinders, right, the immersive feeling. So it's so important. I think what depersonalization teaches us is the importance of invisible things and in the importance of things that we take for granted in the everyday life, that we have there and we don't realize that we have there. And I think in the personalization, sadly, people realize that they do have a sense of self. So we do have a sense of self, except that it's changed, it's modified, it's not the same as before, and it stands in the way between their own experiences and the feeling of immersiveness in the world. Yeah. So I'd say, if I'm right, I might be wrong, I'd say that the more people will try to actively forget about themselves and stop worrying about themselves, about their former self or the sense of self, and engage in very low level, very simple things, activities with their bodies in the world, right? The more you go back to the basis, which is, as I said, is like this bodily self, which is still there. Yourself is still there. You're breathing, you're alive. You withdraw your arm into the pain if you feel the pain. So the job is done for the self-preservation, right? Definitely done, right? But the more go back to the basis, I'd say that the higher phenomenological sense of self will come for free, right? Mm-hmm. But if you approach the problem from the other way around, from the top down, so to speak, from the first, I need to figure out what is wrong in the brain. What is this happening here in my head? And once I figure out, then I'm going to apply, once I figure out, I'm going to understand, then I sort it out, right? I don't think it's working, and this is not going to work for a very basic reason. So I'm just to give you one comparison, one example. So if somebody learns what is going on in your brain when your body swims, right? So you know everything what is going on in your brain when your body needs to swim. Now, and if somebody actually swims, right, as you learn how to swim. Now, if I throw you into the water, just by knowing what is going on in your brain when you swim, are you going to be able to actually swim, right? So my answer, my hunch would be no. This is just by knowing what is going on in the neural mechanism in the brain, it's not going to give you the actual experience of swimming. So what you really need to go back to go back to is the experience of being a self in the world, and that goes necessarily by being immersed into the world, because we are not isolated, right? We need to interact with things, we need to interact with people. And anecdotally, as I said, this is still ongoing work. We still need to figure out what is going on there. So I'm saying again and again and again, we need to be cautious. But from my observation, what I see is that people need to, because sometimes dissociation and depersonalization is a fluctuating feeling. So sometimes you are more or less detached. You feel more or less detached. Well, you know better than me because you experience this. So it's not as if you are in a dissociative state, all the time the same way. So it comes with high or low level intensities, right? So people sometimes told me that when they feel that they go into the high level intensity dissociative states, they feel the need to immediately interact, to have closer interaction with objects in the world, right? So to move around, to smell things, to touch things, but sometimes even get very close physically with the closed ones, right? Like to have the tactile experiences. And that comes like a natural response and intuitive response, because suppose I lost track of my hand. I don't know where my hand is in space for some reasons, because let's say there is some alteration in the way my brain processes the information, the sensory information from my hand. What do I do, right? So if I touch with my hand an object, that object will give information to my brain of where the not me or the not I is, right? So I know where the object is. So the contrast between I and non-I and me and non-me gives you the information where the I is, right? So this is why I need this kind of like contrast. And this is why when people would go, or they have the feeling that they go in this kind of high level dissociative states, they feel the need to engage, because that is precisely the contrast of the engagement with the external world, and the sensory engagement with the external world gives them extra information about themselves, right? So where the self is, where is my hand, where do I feel what I'm feeling right now? So so I think that's something very very striking and very important. We have to keep that in mind, because the natural response would be to, as you said, to withdraw into one's head and try to figure out what is going on. But by doing this, it's like you basically, you're fueling the problem, right?